halfway through this process, so I think we're starting to get some of the real meat of this. So welcome everybody. I think everyone's been doing an awesome job. There's a ton of work that's coming out. It's been kind of exciting keeping up with all the emails and all the conversations about some of these recommendations, and seeing some of the traction, good, bad, and otherwise, I think, with the public, I think on some of the recommendations that have been kind of moving out. A couple little things that I did want to go over is the agenda for today. We'll have the welcome up until about now. We have a consent agenda with a handful of items on there to approve. We have the HPAC recommendation for review process that Matt will go over. And then we have round one, meeting 3. So these are some of the last items that need to get a final permission or final preliminary approval to go forward and kind of get put on our shelf until we do the final review closer to the end of the year. And then we'll get into the meat of the meeting, which is the work group round 2 for meetings 1 of 3 for the next round of recommendations that have come out of all your work. I do know that we do have one item that is on the for item 2, our work group recommendations round number 1 for meeting 3. There's another recommendation that is being put forward that was tabled at the last meeting from the finance committee. And so I would like to entertain a motion to add that to the agenda for review today.
Yeah, JD, I'll move to add the move to add the transportation recommendation from finance to the agenda where you stated.
Okay. And do we need to do a roll call, Matt, or should we just by acclamation see if anybody?
You can do without objection.
Yeah. Anybody have an objection to adding that to the agenda? Seeing none, I will go ahead and add that, and Matt will update that, and we'll make sure we include that when we get to that topic.
I was slow to my question, Chair Tovey. Can you clarify that you said transportation recommendation from the Finance Committee?
Yes, I meant the infrastructure recommendation from the Finance Committee that's been in discussion.
I assume, Daniel, that's what you were referencing.
That's what I meant. Yes, I said transportation. I mean the things that the infrastructure for the transportation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joel.
Sorry about that. Okay, and I'm working off a laptop, so I'm running 2 computers and 3 screens. So I'm gonna keep as up on top of everything as I can. So if I can't see it, just speak up if I don't call on you as quickly as possible. The next thing we'll do is jump to the consent agenda. Do you want to go over that, Matt?
Yep. So we have two consent agenda items for the financing committee to add new topics to the work group. And then we have no items for the transfers between work groups.
Does anyone have any questions about those items? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to approve the consent agenda items for assignment.
I'll move approval of the consent agenda.
Thank you, Margaret. And any discussion or?
I second it.
Okay, was that Riley?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Or anybody not approve or not wish to recommend that? Seeing none, I think we approve that, so we can get those assigned. Thank you, everybody. And moving on to the next item will be also to Matt on the recommendation and review process.
All right, great. Good afternoon, members of the council and members of the public who are watching. As has become standard, at the beginning of the meetings, we like to talk through what the council's review process is for recommendations based on the guidance provided by co-chairs Tovey and Hall. Essentially, all the work groups are up and running, and they are diving into different topics that have been assigned to them and developing potential recommendations. Once a work group feels that they have a recommendation that they support, either by majority or consensus, they can move it up to the full council for consideration. The co-chairs do a review to make sure each recommendation meets some kind of basic due diligence, not from a policy standpoint, but in terms of filling out the forms and going through the process. And then the council considers recommendations, potential recommendations over the course of 2 to 3 meetings. I would anticipate it's going to be 3 meetings moving forward, just because recommendations are starting to come out of work groups. So the first meeting is the introduction of the recommendation. And so we have a number of those today where they're being introduced for the first time at the council. The purpose of meeting 1 is to have the work group members identify or walk through the recommendation, and then have council members identify any additional information, questions, have a little bit of a discussion in order to provide some guidance to the work groups on the information they should bring back in meetings 2 and 3. In meeting number 2, there's continued discussion as well as public comment on all of the recommendations, both written and verbal public comment on the recommendations that were introduced in the first meeting. And then in the third meeting, the council has further discussion, and then you all will decide whether or not to adopt any recommendation on a preliminary basis. And then as a reminder, all recommendations are preliminary until the end of the year, when the report is finalized and the recommendations are finalized. And this is both to make sure that there's any reconciliation between recommendations that do come out that may overlap or may be in slight conflict, and also allows the full council to see the whole picture of the sets of recommendations that they'll be submitting to the governor for her consideration. So that is the overview of our process.
Thank you so much. And so our next item is work group recommendations round number 1 for meeting 3. So that is these items, the one that we added to the agenda, as well as the one from Eric Olson, land development permit applications. So this is to expand the current building codes division capacity for streamlining plan review and site inspections to accommodate increased levels of production at the local level. Eric is absent, but I believe Natalie is up to give a presentation on that.
So based on some of the testimony received at the last meeting, we decided to make a few changes that you can see on the recommendation in red. Basically, we're clarifying what this applies to, which would be housing production. So this wouldn't apply for all construction. And then to increase the number of qualified individuals or entities who are certified by the state to provide plan review and inspection services for local jurisdictions. So that's getting referred to the workforce group. So that was something that was brought up by some public testimony. Jonathan Balcama from the city of Albany, I believe, brought that up. And then we also added, per his comments, what you can see under D2, that affordable housing projects in excess of 20 units where the local jurisdiction cannot meet plan review timelines specified by the building code. So that was just trying to keep plan review at the local level, but providing this out for the state if possible. Comments were received about changing F to try and expand that to give more time. The comments were, if you remember, that it was not realistic that the inspections could be turned around in a 1-day time period. But we liked to keep this because it says it's a target, not a mandate. And so we would hope that that would be the target. And so we decided to keep that as is. And those were all the changes that we decided to make per public testimony.
Thank you. Is there any questions for Natalie or her team on this recommendation? And hearing or seeing none.
Does that mean that that we're going to refer to the workforce group that the land development has taken their hands off, and so we're going to take it up at our next meeting? Is that what that means? At our next workforce meeting?
It's just referring that one section of the recommendation, which dovetails pretty well into what the work you guys are already doing, which would be to try and increase more people who can do building inspection.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? And I do apologize. Like I said, I'm on one screen, so I'm scrolling through and seeing if I see any hands. If there are no other, then I would take a motion to preliminarily adopt this recommendation for, is that the terminology we use?
Yep.
Okay,
And JD, I'll let you know if there's any hands raised.
okay, sounds good. And I guess we'll go by, do we need a roll call on this, Matt? Okay, so
Yeah.
you want to go ahead and do that?
Senator Jama had a hand raised.
Oh, yeah,
No, sorry, that was it. I'll wait until the motion is made, sorry.
okay. So okay, so Senator Jama, you're making the motion?
No, I'm gonna wait until the motion is made.
Okay, okay. Would anybody care to make the motion?
I'll move preliminary adoption of this recommendation.
Thank you. I think it was the Margaret. Yep, thank you.
Yes.
Any seconds?
I'll second it. It's Deb Flagon.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go ahead and do a roll call vote.
First, co-chair Tovey, discussion, if there's anybody that has.
Oh,
to-
yes, yeah.
And Senator Jama.
Thank you. I just want to let you know, folks, I'm gonna be abstaining voting because I was absent for meetings, and so not that I am not opposed or the what is being proposed, but just because I was absent, I will refrain for voting today.
Thank you, Senator. Any other discussion? Okay, now I guess we'll go to votes.
Hey, Councilmember Bunn,
Yes.
Councilmember Flagon,
Yes.
Councilmember Gertler, who may not be here yet. Councilmember Mills,
Yes.
Councilmember Rajbaida,
Yes.
Councilmember Matthews,
Yes.
Councilmember Madsen,
Yes.
Councilmember Wood may not be here yet. Councilmember Rockwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Van Vliet,
Yes.
Councilmember Janney,
Yes.
Councilmember Hill,
Yes.
Councilmember Justice,
Yes.
Senator Jama.
Abstain.
Abstaining. Senator Anderson,
Yes.
Representative Dexter,
Yes.
Representative Helfrich is absent. Director Bateman,
Yes.
Co-Chair Hall,
Yes.
Co-Chair Tubby.
Yes,
Motion passes.
great. Thank you, everybody. That was some really good work. So the next item we have on the third reading is for the infrastructure fund from finance. And I believe, is it Ivory or Daniel going to report on this?
I think we're both happy to report on it. I'll start, and Ivory, feel free to jump in. So we had really good discussion at the first two meetings about this, and we've had two meetings at the Finance Committee in the intervening time. One of the work products that came out of that was a decision that for our future recommendations, simplifying and focusing on the core finance recommendation and staying out of the weeds on implementation. What that means for this one is we needed to do a little bit of simplifying and paring back. So Up on your screen is a revised recommendation. The core of the recommendation is unchanged, and based, at least on my understanding from full HPAC and from the Finance Committee meetings, the core of the recommendation has unanimous support. There is a deficit in financing for local infrastructure, and that makes a direct nexus to the ability to produce housing, and there needs to be more funding of it. So that is the proposition that we are asking full HPAC to vote on. Damien, our co-chair, made some edits to this at the just in the last couple of hours that I think really clarify and simplify the implementation discussion we got into. So Matt, or whoever's screen sharing, if you can scroll down to section 9, that's the area that had the stuff we were wordsmithing over. So the original text was some consensus text that came out of the finance work group in the last few days, and this is a simplification that's been recommended by the co-chairs. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to read it, but ultimately I think it's appropriate for us to seek tentative approval at this meeting. Ivory, does that give a fair summary of the last 14 days of the back and forth on this?
Yes, absolutely. It gives a fair summary. I just want to add to the revisions and the policy options. I hope that you'll find that and be supportive of the revised language, because it does capture where we're all trying to get, and making sure that we have outlined the different levels of affordability, and also looking at our policies through an equity lens. So hopefully we all can support this recommendation.
For those of you who read through all of the proposals last night, like I did, you'll notice some of this language is eerily familiar to what came out of Deb's group. So credit where credit is due. We shamelessly lifted some. And we got to jump the gun on you guys in the agenda. So sorry about that. But it's a broad ranging topic that hits multiple work groups. And we've discussed this before at the co-chairs meetings, that there are going to be multiple recommendations that overlap, and that's okay. And we may have to do some reconciliation or tying things up at the end, but there was some really good work product that came out of, committees other than finance that is appropriate here. So,
yeah. And I'll add to that,
kind of
it's expected that we'll have the overlap. We'll expect to have that overlap and be able to look at these holistically when they're all laid out on the table when they're done. So any questions for the finance chairs on this topic?
Yeah, what does demonstrated commitment mean?
On the second bullet point, prioritizing cities that have
Third bullet point down, let's see, is it second? Yeah, second bullet point, yes. Demonstrated commitment, what does that mean?
I believe that's a Daniel or Ivory.
oh yeah, I'll take a stab at it. Mr. Hill, I think you're right. It's a little bit squishy. It's not a fleshed out OAR that's ready to be applied. I think the intent here is that if the state is going to bring new resources to bear for infrastructure, we want them to flow to cities that are trying to address the housing shortage. There's more local infrastructure need than we can probably raise money for at the state level. There's going to be some process of rationing it, and that process of rationing is going to include a filter that prioritizes cities that are trying to add more to their housing stock. That's my read on it, at least.
Thank you.
Co-Chair Tuvey, you've got a hand up from Representative Dexter.
I see. Thank you. Representative Dexter.
Thank you so much. So I know that as Senator Jama mentioned, I haven't been able to attend all the meetings. I was there for part of this discussion at the last meeting, but I did not see this come out, the financing recommendations specifically that we're, I think, about to vote on. I didn't see these in advance, so I really don't know that I've had sufficient time. I just wonder if there's any others who might be in that position and if this should be moved to a vote on at our 9 to 8 meeting so that we do have time. Otherwise, I'm happy to abstain.
Thank you for that. I guess, I mean, I'm looking at Matt. This was kind of a co-chair's prerogative, I think, a little bit on whether or not we bring it up. Do you want to go ahead, Damon? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go just sort of talk about why there is an edit. You know, everything except for these limited edits to section 9, the policy option, I believe, was circulated to the entirety of the group. And what the policy option just says is, here's where we're kind of drawing the line on the recommendation. We're not getting into, you know, the prioritization of expenditures in this particular recommendation, because a lot of the really good kind of fulsome policy debate wasn't around whether or not there should be a recommendation for an infrastructure fund. There seemed to be pretty clear consensus on that, but then there were differing perspectives and differing kind of policy objectives about how, in a world of limited funding, infrastructure investments would be made and prioritized. And I think, you know, the good part of this is we have a lot of space between now and the end of the year to continue that conversation and apply, you know, more analysis as opposed to kind of anecdotal kind of advocacy type things to that, and really get into what is the incremental value of infrastructure investment at different levels of affordability and based on different levels of anticipated, you know, full build out of an area and all those type of things. But we felt like we had a consensus around the mechanics of there should be an infrastructure fund that makes areas available for housing production that otherwise are held up indefinitely or beyond the planning horizon. So that's what this was intended to capture. It wasn't trying to change the content, but really to find you know, consensus on this one limited issue, and then create some certainty around, yes, that other issue is a good discussion and will be ongoing, and document that as well. So that's what was the intent there.
Thank you, Damien. Director Bateman.
Thank you, chairs. Could you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm on new headphones. I don't know if they work or not. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to add a quick comment here. Thank you for bringing this back this time without specifying or naming the funding source. A lot more work to be done in that area, so I'm much more comfortable with it now. And I may be more comfortable with it than some others because this language is familiar coming out of the land readiness and availability group. I have seen it before. I thought it looked familiar. And I appreciate that that's in here, just an additional way to say, to recognize we have scarcity, we have scarce resources. Let's try to prioritize a little bit. So I appreciate pulling out those applications that might actually help rise to the top and get money where it needs to go in a more focused fashion. Appreciate you're doing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those comments. Anybody else have any discussion or questions for the chairs? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion, up, down, or otherwise.
I'll try again, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Let's see. I move for preliminary adoption of the infrastructure recommendation.
Okay.
Second.
And Robert Justice seconded it. Thank you.
Yes.
Any discussion? Hearing none, we will go to a roll call vote.
Councilmember Bunn,
Yes.
Councilmember Flagon,
Yes.
Councilmember Gertler, not with us yet. Councilmember Mills,
Yes.
Councilmember Fonseca's not here. Councilmember Rajbaida,
Yes.
Councilmember Matthews,
Yes.
Councilmember Madsen,
Yes.
Councilmember Wood is not here yet. Councilmember Rockwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Van Vliet,
Yes.
Councilmember Janney,
Yes.
Councilmember Hill,
Yes.
Councilmember Justice,
Yes.
Senator Jama,
Abstain.
Senator Anderson,
Yes.
Representative Dexter,
Abstain.
Director Bateman,
Yes.
Co-Chair Hall,
Yes.
Co-Chair Tubby.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you, everybody. That was an excellent discussion and good work on working through some challenging conversations. We're going to have plenty of those in the next 4 or 5 months. So that takes care of our round 1, meeting 3 items. So we'll be moving on now to the work group recommendations. This is the round 2, so meeting 1 of 3. If I remember correctly, there's not going to be much to approve for this other than just going through and getting the first reading of these recommendations. So we'll go through each of them and have a presentation, have some questions, and then they'll be coming up for round 2, meeting 2 of 3 for preliminary approval in the next couple of weeks. And then if they don't go through that, if there's more additional questions at that time, especially from the public, then they'll be moved on to meeting 3, much like our last agenda item. So is Erica on? I think we wanted to go reverse order because finance was always up first. So
I am on, but if we could go back to the other order, that would be helpful. My flight was delayed and I'm caught in traffic on my way home. So
okay.
If we could, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yep, we can accommodate that. So we'll go to the next item, which is Natalie Janney for codes and design, expansion of ready built plans.
Oh, Co-Chair Tubby, we're going to move that one to the 9/8 HPAC meeting.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, I didn't see that. I don't have, okay. So modify housing appeals, land use procedures.
Yep, thank you very much. If you want to, Matthew, if you want to pull up that PowerPoint and skip to slide 7, because no, that's right. Slide 1's right on that one. I'm thinking of land permitting. So I have 2 that I'm going to present now. The third one coming out of our group that we'll discuss, we wanted to present today, was about tree codes, and Justin did most of the work on that one. So I would like him to present that, and he is not available yet. So I'm going to be talking about changes to the appeal process, and then another one about hearing time. So yes, so this is the text of the general recommendation. Basically, it's to update the hearing process for residential housing so that appeals and call-ups would be based on and required to state the specific design approval in question. It would also change where appeal hearings would go. It would direct all appeals to go to a hearings officer rather than a planning commission or a city council. And in cities where they do not have a hearings officer, the Council of Governments would work to do that assignment of hearings officers to provide that service around the state. Also, it would change state law to remove the requirement for a de novo hearing. Currently, that is apparently in state law. Not all jurisdictions do that. There's some where they get to decide if they want to have a de novo hearing here on the issue or on the record. And so this would, this recommendation would move to remove the requirement for the de novo hearing so that when you're having an appeal hearing, it's just based on the issue that's being appealed and not opening up the whole project. And then applications that are going into an appeal with approval, the approval would be allowed to stand. So the idea being that if you're having an appeal on an issue, that you would be looking at conditions of approval that would change, that would address the appeal issue and would not strike down the whole housing regulation or the whole housing development. And then also that the legislature should define adequate findings in an effort to eliminate the need to respond endlessly to public comments and questions. That is currently pretty vague. Next slide, please. So the reason we're addressing this issue is basically there's a lot of uncertainty and delay that can come with appeal hearings. They're not always required to be stated what the issue is. So you end up having to, you can kind of go into them blind as the applicant. They are going in front of planning commissions and city councilors who are volunteers, who are not experts in land use law all the time. And so this just creates a lot of uncertainty, and the hearings can be extremely long because there can be a lot of staff time that has to be dedicated towards making sure that city council stays within the purview, city council or planning commission stays within their purview. And even when appeals are found to be either baseless, like not based on any of the criteria, or the approval is withheld, the delay can result in an overall increase of project costs just due to changes in the housing market, supply chain, inflation, things of that nature. Next slide. So the expected outcome would be that we would just be ensuring that applications are based on the law and reviewed by people who are well versed in land use law. Hopefully this will cut back on baseless appeals, because now not just anyone can appeal for the effect of delaying a project. They have to be able to state the specific criteria that's not being met. And it would also hopefully lower the likelihood of concessions in design that don't conform with design standards and land use code. I know I've had examples of projects where in order to get council to just approve it in an appeal, you end up having to either lower a building height when you're not, we wouldn't otherwise be required to based on the underlying zone. And then moving the appeals to the hearings officers could reduce the number of appeals that are sent to LUBA, because you wouldn't necessarily have procedural issues or things not based on the code that could lead to a denial. Next slide, please. So we did have some feedback from some land use attorneys, City of Portland, City of Salem, and League of Oregon Cities. Generally, they liked this recommendation. They liked the idea of it going to a hearings officer rather than having to help volunteers on planning commission or city council who aren't experts in land use law. They did mention that they pay for a hearings officer, so it would not be, there would be a cost associated with moving things from a free city council to a hearings officer. However, there could be trade-offs in the amount of staff time that it takes. Hearings wouldn't be as long, so they wouldn't have to pay staff as much. Also, and the prep time needed for it wouldn't be as great. And then the League of Oregon Cities did mention that not all cities have hearings officers or funds for them. And that's why that it was included in the recommendation that Council of Governments would help to facilitate making sure that all cities had access to a hearings officer. And so that's that recommendation. I'm happy to have any questions on it.
Thank you for that, Natalie. Any questions for the work group? Seeing none, we can go on to the next one then, the hearings time and standard.
Great. So this one has to do with the fact that applicants are required to meet the burden of proof, right? That's on the applicant to prove that they are meeting all the standards for an application. But this can be a challenge on large, complicated projects because different cities handle time limits differently. So I don't know if you want to bring up, I had the next slide, Matthew, the presentation. So some cities allow you to have 15 minutes total for your applicant's presentation and rebuttal, and they let you split it up. And if you run out of time in your presentation, they don't allow you rebuttal time, which I'm pretty sure is against the law, but that's okay. Some give you 10 minutes and 5 minutes. Sometimes if you ask for extra time, they'll give it to you, but sometimes they won't. So this would just be a statutory minimum. So there'd be, and also staff can take 30 minutes plus in order to do a staff report. I'm not advocating for longer public hearings, but since the burden is on the applicant, I just think it might help if you had a little bit more time. So this would say that the applicant is granted as much time as staff with a minimum of 15 minutes. And then you would get a minimum 5 minutes for rebuttal, but you would get 1 additional minute for each person who spoke. So you don't get a 1-to-1 time, but you get 1 minute for each person. And then if the planning commission or the city council were to ask questions of staff, the applicant would also get a chance to answer the same questions, even if the hearing has been closed. So that's the recommendation. Next slide, please. So just as I said, the issue that we're trying to address here is allowing the applicant more time in order to meet their burden of proof. When you have very long staff reports and applicants don't agree with staff, it can be really hard in 10 minutes to present your case for the project as well as why you have a different opinion than staff. So allowing more time in that initial applicant's presentation should help remedy that. I've been at public hearings, unfortunately, where public testimony was literally hours, and then we still had 5 minutes of rebuttal. So it can be really challenging to offset hours of opposition testimony in 5 minutes. And then I've also been at hearings where the reviewing body, the planning commission or the council, don't ask any questions of the applicant. They save it all for when the hearing is closed, and then they ask a ton of questions to staff. And so we don't always have the same answers. We have different perspectives as applicants, right, that staff may have. So this would allow the applicant to have the chance to answer those questions from their perspective as well. Next slide, please. The expected outcome would just be that more time could help projects get approved without extra conditions due to maybe a lack of understanding or miscommunication or a LUBA appeal. There's virtually no extra cost to implement this. And although nobody wants longer hearings, this is just about letting them have more time, not mandating that anyone take more time. And so I think that is generally all that I had for this recommendation too, if anyone had any questions.
Any questions for the codes and design work group? No questions. Excellent work. Thank you. Thank you. So we go on. So and who's going to be doing the street standards? I didn't get the name.
Justin would, when he is available, he will be able to talk through the tree code.
I'm just going to put that on my list to come back to by the end of the meeting.
Thank you.
And so the next one on our list is from Eric Olson, land development permit applications. I don't believe he's here today, but some of the other work group members are going to be presenting on this. The first one is modified cottage cluster courtyard and utility requirements.
That's me again.
Oh, there you are.
If you can pull up that PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. So this recommendation basically says changes the code for middle housing options for cottage clusters. So cottage clusters with 5 or less living units would not be required to have a courtyard, and that they would not be required to have separate utilities for each unit if the units, if they're either part of an HOA, which is assuming responsibility for that shared maintenance, or is otherwise deed restricted to assure that maintenance and cost sharing are associated with that utility. And so next slide, please. This is to address the topic that in that work group to remove barriers and make it less complicated to build smaller, more affordable homes. Next slide. The primary goal is that it would allow more more properties to take advantage of the cottage cluster option, which can be a challenge right now because primarily because of that courtyard requirement. And then removing some of that shared utility or the separate utilities for units will help make it more flexible when you're designing those projects. Next slide, please. The expected outcome is that it'll be easier to develop cottage clusters, which would increase density and hopefully make a cheaper product for people to buy. Next, I think that's it. I think that the next one is questions. So, yeah.
Representative Dexter, do you have a question?
I do, thank you. So I recognize that this is on a small scale. So with 5 or fewer units, this may not be as big of an issue, but I do know that there are some HOAs that with low income occupiers in particular, that they will pay the water bill or the utility bill and then bill the individual units. And then when members aren't able to pay, that drains the HOA of its funds pretty quickly, and that can be an issue. And I just wonder if there were was discussion on that and whether this is perceived as a significant problem.
I don't believe we really discussed that aspect of it. I know that there are private metering companies that can meter water and pay the bills on the other side of it, so it doesn't necessarily fall to the HOA. I know I lived in one, so I know it exists, but I don't know that we had that. We can talk about that though.
As a follow-up.
Go ahead. Yep.
Thanks. I know that in the city of Portland, this has been an issue for some HOAs. So I would just like to make sure that we're not creating another issue downstream for low income occupiers, whether it's a renter or owner who might then be taken to court, which can obviously expeditiously create more problems for those people who live in the units. So if anyone in particular I should talk to you about this, I'd really appreciate a follow-up email so I can understand the issue better afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, I know that they're like behind a water meter, you can install a manifold system that would allow you to pull the lines for the individual units off of the one service. And I don't know if those have individual shutoffs, because that would likely be how that would be handled, right? If you're not paying your share, then they would go and shut off the portion on your manifold. I don't know. I'm assuming that's the case, but I'll look into that and get back to you.
Thank you. And I see a question from Councilman Hill.
Mine is more of a procedure question because these recommendations are really varied. Are we going to act on them individually or going to lump them all together?
How do you mean? Oh, you mean for all the recommendations?
Yes.
So this is the first reading for all these recommendations. So these are just getting them out to the council, to all the council members for their review and their input. And then it actually comes back for either preliminary adoption at the next meeting, as well as any kind of public input as well. So right now, we're not really taking action on all these. We're just getting them out for the first reading.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions for the, let's say, land development permit application group on this recommendation? Senator Jama?
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to second what Representative Dexter said. We're just actually, now my office actually dealing with the same scenario where folks are struggling to separate the utilities and water. So I think it's a real issue. So I would love to be looped as well.
And Councilmember Hill, your hand's still up. Do you have another question or? Oh, no, you're good.
Sorry, no.
No, you're good. Any other comments or questions for the work group? All right, thank you so much. And our next item is the modified residential permit review standards. And Matt, I don't have that last agenda that has who's presenting. So I'm not sure who's up. Looks like, is Natalie up again? This is
Yeah,
Natalie
it's Natalie.
It's me again.
Oh, there you go. It's a Natalie show.
I know, sorry.
Nope, thank you.
All right, Matthew, if you want to pull up that PowerPoint again, this one's a little bit meatier. Hopefully, maybe you had a chance to review. I'll try not to talk too fast. I feel like I'm talking too fast. The point of this recommendation is to help facilitate coordination and speed up the review process for getting plans approved, both public construction plans as well as private and building plans. So it says that at a first review, that needs to be a thorough review. That's basically the city gets to have a really thorough look. They look through everything. They need to use that time to list all discrepancies, all questions, how they are maybe not meeting the code. They would need to reference the code section that they are not meeting, and clearly state all the issues. This is kind of their like big crack at it. And then from here, they don't get to have another, they don't get to add to the list unless it is a fire life or safety issue, which fire life and safety is pretty broad when we're talking about public facilities anyway. I mean, you could say almost anything is that, but after you get your first round of comments back, there's to be a meeting scheduled within 5 days. The meeting doesn't have to occur within 5 days, but within 5 days, it needs to be scheduled in order to discuss all of the comments and concerns that the city may have based on those plans. Small changes that aren't going to have a substantial change in the design should be allowed to be addressed after the construction permits are issued. And the reviewing jurisdictions are to develop clear and objective standards for their plan review submittals. So this is actually required under needed housing, but it's not exactly clear to jurisdictions that they are required to have clear and objective standards for engineering standards. But this is something that was clarified by Sean Edging with DLCD. Cities have 120 days for their permit issuance. The 120 days is the number of days that they get to have the plans for review. So it's not the total from the first submittal to when it's approved. Anytime that it's returned to the design professional, the clock would stop. So it doesn't account for delays or time taken up by the private design team. When multiple agencies are involved, they each would get 120 days to approve it. They wouldn't be reliant on 120 days. That wouldn't be fair for, City of Tigard to have to wait for clean water services and have that be commingled. And then jurisdictions will be required to develop checklists for all necessary paperwork, applications, signatures, documents, and submittals that would be required through the land use, construction, and building permit phase. And items can only be added to the list in order to address fire life safety. That's basically, if you come in for your pre-app with your project, they give you the whole list of everything you need, and that's what you're bound to. So if they accidentally forgot to say you needed a driveway permit application, that can't be used against you when you're in the land use process. And then, the checklists are required for construction and building permits after the first review too, as previously outlined. So that's the bulk. There's a lot more words used to describe it, but that's the bulk of that recommendation. Next slide, please. So the housing issue is that there's no statutory timeline for public plan approval. And public plan approval is becoming a longer and longer process. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody here. Reviews are not always thorough or specific enough to ensure that issues can be found and addressed in a timely manner. Sometimes you get 6 comments, and then the next time you get 20 comments, and they're totally different comments in the first set of comments, which can make it really hard to near the finish line. More often than not, later review comments don't usually result in a substantive change in the design. They might want little changes here and there, but overall how the project gets built is basically the same. Checklists of required documents will ensure that the reviewing bodies have all the information they need for a thorough review, right? It's not realistic to expect jurisdictions to review things in a timely manner if they don't have all the information. That's not fair. So this would help make sure that they have all the information that they need in order to thoroughly provide that review that's necessary. And like I said, the overall goal is just to increase cooperation and communication between reviewers and design professionals. A lot of times we will get comments back that are listed as questions, which are really hard to address as comments. And then you think you addressed it. And then the next time you get another review that says, as previously commented, blah, blah, blah. And you think you addressed it, but it didn't. So next slide, please. So the expected outcome, as I said, is just to try and increase cooperation and communication between the two reviewing bodies. This is actually something that they're trying, not the timeline part, but the communication part is something that they're trying to implement in several cities. We did have City of Portland, they're trying to implement these meetings to talk through issues. Turns out engineers maybe aren't the best at communicating with each other. The goal would be to reduce the number of reviews to about 3. If in 120 days, if the city took 30 days per review, they would have 4. They would have enough time for 4. But the understanding would be that the overall responsibility to provide clear construction documents that satisfy the code falls to the stamping design professional. So this is kind of taking that and placing that responsibility back on the design professional for them to be responsible for. Next slide. We did get quite a bit of feedback. Cities don't necessarily like the time limit portion of it. They feel like it pushes the quality control back onto the jurisdiction. The additional mandates in the past haven't helped with streamlining things. Requiring that sections of the code to be mentioned will result in a longer time to review documents, but also that private design, they also mentioned, so they mentioned that, but then they also said private designers aren't experts in the code. So checklists could be difficult to compile and they'd be dependent on the level of detail provided at the pre-app, which I agree with, and that cities can't compel other entities to provide checklists. The 120-day timeframe would be difficult with multiple reviewing bodies, which is why we specified that different reviewing bodies would also have 120 days. Requests were made for more time, more than 120 days for larger projects, so larger timeframes consideration for a more complicated project. And then testimony in the past we have heard has been that the problem with long plan review has been a lack of quality submittals. So providing a thorough list of all things that are needed for this submittal would help hopefully increase the quality of the submittal. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Natalie. Any questions for the land development permit application recommendation? Representative Dexter.
Thank you. I hope I don't become the problem child with questions every time. So thank you, Co-Chair Tovey, sorry. One question I have is there wide variability for what constitutes a substantial change that would then have different requirements for appeals and whatnot? Is that based on the jurisdiction or are they standardized?
No, that was more anecdotal. We've seen projects where we've been asked to change inverts on pipes 1/100th of a foot on construction drawings. Well, you can't construct to that level of specificity. So, or they'll have you go back and change your whole stormwater report to include an extra 20 square feet of area. So those types of changes, while they might be done to make to make it correct, they don't change what's being built. So that's more what that's in reference to.
If I can have a follow-up.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. So I guess the question that I have is less about, what a small change is, but how you standardize that so that developers or contractors have a level of clarity on what would constitute a substantial change and that you can expect a delay if you are getting something that's reported in the interval. I just am thinking from a governance perspective, if it's variable in every jurisdiction, that might create some confusion, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but those of you who are involved in these things can help me understand.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it. It wasn't something, like I said, I know several times when I've been asked to change a multiple 100-page document in order to include something where what is on the construction drawings doesn't change. I don't know if anyone else, Corey, if you had anything to add, I don't know.
I mean, I think the substantial change would be like quite a degree of like a major program change and all of that, which I don't think usually is the case. That's typically tends to trigger a whole different intake. So I think what Natalie and we are talking about is the same project within certain variations within that's allowed, you know.
Yeah, and forgive me. So we just have heard quite a bit about the variability and predictability being important for projects. And so I think what I'm concerned about is if it can be used as, you know, potentially delay if someone has arguments over what substantiates being a substantial change, whether there's guidelines or anything that should be in the recommendation so that there isn't wide variability and delays as a result of that. So again, when you leave it somewhat nebulous, I wonder if that can be used against the process that we're trying to expedite, if that makes sense. And maybe I'm just not understanding it fully.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much we want to try and get in the weeds. I mean, that's pretty in the weeds for something like this. So I'm not, I mean, I'm happy we can explore kind of putting that level of specificity in. I guess I would leave that to the co-chairs to decide if that's something they'd like us to explore.
Totally fair. Thanks.
And that's something I think we all struggle with is, you know, we want to make recommendations, but then not go so far into the weeds that we are, because all this stuff, these are recommendations are going to be hammered out later through legislative process, through developmental process. And so I think even just putting a statement on there that providing some kind of assurance or some kind of guidelines around what substantial changes are, I think is valid, or at least making that highlight that that's something that's going to have to be addressed or at least like hammered out in the implementation phase after the recommendations are made.
Yeah, we can make that addition.
Representative Dexter.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. So I just having gone through this with 3414 and with 2001 and as the legislator who's not the subject matter expert, like when we are trying to hammer out those details and we don't necessarily have the information that you all have at your fingertips as what should be considered a substantial change, I'm just anticipating that statutory development and understanding that I'm not going to know that. And so it would be actually helpful for maybe examples. And if I'm overthinking this, I just think from a governance perspective, making sure that the law actually does what we want it to do. If that gets hammered out later, fantastic. But I just want to make sure that we don't always know who the right people are to have at the table. And I think you're all here. So making sure that we have that. Thanks.
Excellent perspective, Representative Dexter.
If I may, you know, the next recommendation actually that we're going to talk about actually, Representative Dexter, is actually on some alignment with the 3414, you know, talking about the adjustments. So, you know, when our co-chair, our work group chair, Natalie Jenny, when she's mentioning some of these things, some of the recommendations that we're bringing forth, I know is going to work in tandem with each other. So when she's saying like substantial change, maybe this, the next recommendation that we're bringing around the adjustments can help sort of articulate some of that, right? I know right now when we look at or listen to each recommendation on its own, it feels a little bit like disjointed. But if you look at it, all these different recommendations that the work group is really working at, it's really kind of working with each other. So when you know, Chair Jenny presented the appeal, that aligns with, you know, what might trigger that the appeal and what that hearing might happen, how that hearing might happen. And so we're kind of adding each one to complement the other. And when the council looks at all of these things in holistic way, I feel like there's going to be some more of that synergy that's going to be a lot more apparent, if that says something.
I am happy to add examples. I can add examples in some of the supporting. I won't put it in the body of the recommendation, but I can add it into the explanation for it. So I'm happy to add those examples.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions for this item? Hearing none, we can go on to the next one, which I believe is, am I out of step? Require approval for certain land use design development adjustments for residential development. Are you doing that, Councilmember Kari?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I am.
Great.
Happy if you would pull up the recommendation. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, but I'll just walk through the recommendation. So what we're recommending in this particular aspect is making sure that allowing that the jurisdiction will allow the developers and applicant up to 20% adjustment on any kind of specific land use standards. And this is sort of working in concert with House Bill 3414. Our council member, Tom Cody, really worked on this quite a bit. I'll be presenting this here today for you. And so what we mean by adjustment here is really looking at deviations from the existing land use regulation. It does not necessarily mean completely doing something that is not allowed under zoning. So within the standards and requirements that are required under the zoning, what are the flexibility that is predictable for the applicant, that they know that they can get up to that threshold? So we were really presenting this because so far in the zoning code, there are very few areas where some of these adjustments are allowed, like maybe in some height bonus restrictions that are opened up if it's affordable housing or certain kind of a criteria is met. So what this recommendation is really put forth is to kind of make sure that all in all, overall, every project can get up to 20% of specified, 20% of variability by right in their application. And if you go to the next scroll down. So looking at what are the things that this affects us, the key thing is right now there is a lot of tendency for a lot of the development to kind of stall for minor standard requirements that are not met. So one example might be, let's say, open space requirement. Typically may have a very specific standard that says, and I know this exists, is 20 foot by 20 foot at the least. Now, if you have a site and a particular, especially like smaller sites, where you are able to provide, let's say, 19 foot by 20, and suddenly you're not compliant, to be able to not have to then go through a pretty rigorous adjustment process that requires quite a bit of a back and forth, and then time and money lost in that process. What this allows is right from the get-go, certain amount of flexibility within those requirements, so the constrained sites can actually meet the requirements, still provide the development. So that's really the basis of it, right? And so further down, we have specified also, like for smaller infill projects, this actually ends up becoming a lot more critical and crucial, because infill projects, infill sites tend to have some of those constraints that may not be met by the specific detailed standard requirements, and allowing for some of this flexibility really opens up the potential developable land as well. So that's another consideration that we're trying to put forth. In terms of including a subject matter expert and all of this, we actually looked very closely all the input that's been put forth for House Bill 3414, and looking at all the adjustment requirements that it mentioned. So we went through very categorically through all of that, and the attachment A that we have listed at the end of this recommendation really goes through all of that in very, very listed manner. And we did hear back from Kimberly Talent and also Nick Hodges, who's a principal at Hacker Architects, on some feedback on this. The key thing here is to make sure that we are able to provide this, and the procedural process part of it is actually easier, so the whole back and forth adjustment does not need to happen. So try to make as much as possible that is by right developable, sort of the threshold, right? Next slide, or like not slide, if you scroll down. Look at my highlights. So currently, a lot of these, going back to the question again, like for smaller sites, because of the constraints, a lot of the land just tend to be deemed undevelopable because of the very strict standards that we cannot meet. But if we allow for some of these adjustments, that can either squeeze or shrink some of the requirements, some of these lands can be made available and brought to the sort of the, as a resource. And so that's highly important. As far as the implementation of this particular recommendation goes, we see that as being a very low cost because it's just basically allowing for that flexibility. And the feasibility is actually pretty high, because we already have precedents of some of these adjustments that are required, that are allowed if you do affordable housing, if you provide this AMI, that AMI. So some of these are already being done. We're just trying to add a little more bigger envelope to the whole whole purview of adjustments. The time frame is actually very short because when some of these previous allowed adjustments on parking and things like that were provided, that implementation happened very quickly. Local jurisdictions were able to really implement that very quickly. So we don't see that being much of a problem for us on this one. And what we would recommend here is for this to be initiated by DLCD. And really, this is, again, going in alignment with House Bill 3414. It just provides a little more clarity. HB 3414 had various percentages for various requirements and also a lot of sub-chapters and things like that. We're trying to make this very simpler and across the board, so it's a lot easier to implement. If you scroll down further. So some of the areas where we may want to kind of keep our mind in terms of the key trade-offs, like things that we may need to think of, and potential issues are making sure that the fire life safety requirements, anything that is related to health, life, and safety of the occupants are not compromised in any way. And then reduction of the quality of the development, obviously making sure that that does not happen, that the other neighboring parcels are not impacted. Those are definitely will be taken into account. And that, one potential issues that a lot of the subject matter experts have raised concerns about is that, hey, this may just kind of mean that a lot of the developers will just try to get the maximum adjustment allowed, and then thereby not have the actual impact in the production of the housing units, just makes more expensive and bigger housing development. Well, one way to prevent that then is, and if you look through our detailed attachment and the attachment A and attachment B, you'll see that one of the things we could do is have some sort of a incentive that says, this will be applicable if you are providing this much of housing units. So it's really connected to the housing unit as a motivation, right? So that way, that would be really, controlled in that sense. And let's see, there were. Another thing is, how many of these variations allowed? Because if there is no limit to it, then it may just, by the use of the adjustment, it may be a total rezoning. And so to prevent that, what we are recommending is right now in Exhibit A, we're saying 10 distinct adjustments. And the way we have listed those adjustments, each one would count as one particular independent adjustment. So you get to count 10 out of it. Now, I know City of Portland recommended that maybe it goes down to only 5 and not 10. And that's something that we can kind of keep chewing on, see how that could be determined. Another thing is, for how long do we provide this as a measure? And House Bill 3414 recommended 10 years. City of Portland said maybe look at it as a 5-year thing. And I think as we discuss this further, we can kind of take a look at it and see which one is feasible. I think even 5 years is good to kind of see if whether this has an effect at all or not, right? Another issue is, I think when we say like 20% increase, sometimes some of these adjustments may not necessarily result to a viable answer. So for example, if you have a 45-foot height limit and a 20% increase will be a 9-foot increase, not necessarily a full story. So looking at some of those nuances, we can kind of look to see how do we round out to the next big intelligible discrete number that is valuable, right? Like in this case, for the height, it means the actual story, which is about 10 to 10 and a half. So really looking at some of the nuances to kind of refine that. But otherwise, I think this is something that is going to be very useful in unlocking a lot of the land that otherwise would have been deemed undevelopable. Or also within the project, a lot of the projects tend to be constrained with certain hardships without any other recourse that requires major adjustment procedure that takes time and money and adds the uncertainty because the adjustment may or may not be approved. What this allows is this allows for a lot more predictability. This allows for by right, and this takes away a lot of the procedural and timeline from the entitlement process.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions for sorry. I almost used codes and design, land development permit application process work group. Any questions for anybody? Representative Dexter. I have a question too, so you can jump in.
I almost didn't raise my hand just because
you're
I don't
fine.
want to be that person, but
No,
here
you're
we are. So on the sundown period, we talked a lot about that, and I just had 2 questions as a follow-up. A 5-year sundown, is that enough time to see meaningful change, knowing how long some projects take to get financing and development?
Sure.
Second question is what happens to projects in the process? So if, the 5-year sundown is happening or sunset is happening and there's a project that is in process, but sorry, trying to help my dog, but not yet completed, what would we do with those? And so those are questions just to address in future, but I just raised those because those came up significantly. Thanks.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I mean, even the last 2 projects development that I personally, I myself worked on started before the pandemic, and we just finally finished it, right? So that is about that timeline. So yeah, maybe I think we do need to kind of take a look at it, and maybe what HB 3414 had suggested, the 10-year window is probably more reasonable to really see the impact. So thank you for bringing that up.
I could add too about what would be in place during the sundown. I would imagine we could probably apply a similar way that we do to standards. So you're vested in the standard that is in place at the time that your application is submitted. So I would imagine we could probably do a similar thing with this, so that if your application was submitted prior to the sundown, then you would fall under that.
Be vested.
Right.
And I'm going to jump in and ask a question too. So your example of like the 20 foot by 20 foot green space requirement.
Yeah.
And so as you have it written now, you would have a by right to go down to, that's 400 square feet. So you go down to like 320 square feet. What is that only in the existence of a limitation on being able to provide the 2020 by square?
That's really what I'm saying, like, yeah. So for example, like we have that thing where we have said, like, how certain times some of these, like a 4,000 square feet, property might not open up as like a 5,000, but if we have some of these flexibility, it can be a viable developable land, right? So for a housing unit or 2, and so, yeah.
Well, I just want to make sure that the 20% doesn't, because then everyone just increases their standards by 20% in order to be able to accommodate for the 20% variance that everybody has by right. And then you end up with net zero anyway. And so I guess I just want to make sure that this is, if in a summary, it's kind of like an administrative appeals process for variances to be able, in the existence of a limitation on being able to provide the code requirement, then you can apply the 20% up to 20% without having to go to a public hearing process.
Right, absolutely. And that's really where, a lot of these things come from, right? Like, the hardships, right? Like the hardships, we want to provide, the density allows us to provide, let's say 40 units, but let's say the bike parking wouldn't allow us to get that, but we have the land, we actually have the extrusion ability to kind of do so, but the bikes are holding us for that, right? So at that point, yes, we're in Portland, we love bikes, but I think right now with the crisis, we want the units more, so this allows for that ability for the developers to really look at that, provide the units.
Senator Jama.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation, particularly around, linking to the housing unit productions, as you said, Corey. But I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about that, because I think the goal here again is making the increase the housing production. So if you can say a little bit more about how this will allow more units to be added in terms of density and all that.
Yeah, so thank you, Senator Jama. For example, one of the things like in the some of the housing development I work on, we would like to provide, let's say, 70 units. And with that, some of the key, going back to the same, let's say, bike parking requirement, let's say, right? Like, for example, we are only able to provide, we only have room to provide so many bike parking, let's say in Portland. And that limits us now suddenly, instead of 70 units, we can only do 60 units. Well, forget that example either. Let's say the J District, when we were working on the J District Orchards of 82nd, at the time, some of these parking requirements, adjustment to the parking requirements were quite not readily available. Now, the site could have provided 48 units easily, which is what we built eventually, right? 48 units very, very comfortably. Now, with the parking requirement at the time, we could have only gone up to like about 30 units or so, right? And then obviously the neighbors who did not want this affordable housing, and there was a lot of protest around it, obviously cited those things and basically said, you guys should not have been building 48 units, but you go to that site now at Orchards of 82nd, you know how vibrant that site is, and we know that that 48 unit development works there, right? So, but that parking would have really, really controlled that. Now, if we had had the variation of ability at the time, the ability by right to ask for that adjustment on the parking, we could have easily not gone through the lot of back and forth and arguing with the neighbors and such to actually provide the 48 units. So what this allows is to really provide that maximizing of the unit. And what I brought up as a counterpoint is for those who may look to just basically make a big housing by using these things, what we may want to do is add an incentive here that this gets triggered with a certain amount of minimum number of units that we're trying to provide. So really adding that to the production of units as a motivation.
Senator Jama, you have another.
Thank you. Follow up and just comment. I really appreciate you clarifying that. But I think my goal, again, I understand the increase, how that connects to the increasing production. But as long as we're very clear how we do that, so it doesn't become building just larger housing, that's really the goal. That's what I'm hoping to try to achieve that.
Absolutely, and we pointed that out as one of our, in the unseen effects of this recommendation. We've addressed that, and so that's definitely something we'll consider in the work group for sure.
Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, we can go on to the next one, which I think is also for you, Councilmember Jabaida.
Yes.
Temporary modify residential land use review process standards. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, let me pull up my own as well. So Matthew, if you would pull the recommendation up. So when a major housing development happens, there's always a tendency for it to trigger a type 3 review, which is a public discretionary review with a commission, which has a lot more timeline and actually opens up to a lot of NIMBYism and protest, basically taking away a lot of the predictability and the timeline, the development timeline, extending the development timeline for housing. And that has been a pretty big issue, and that there have been plenty of precedents even within the city of Portland where housing development has stalled through when it has not passed the type 3 design review. A lot of the jurisdictions, big jurisdictions have those type 3 design review. A lot of the jurisdictions already have administrative processes that allow for the administrative process to kind of really provide the decision through type 2 review. What this recommendation really is putting forth is to at least temporarily, to halt all discretionary public type 3 review, or in some smaller jurisdiction where they don't have the big public, it supposedly happens through the city council. So stalling those city council review and providing an avenue to have the development review approved through a simpler type 2 administrative process would really expedite the timeline of entitlement process and also provide a lot more predictability to the development. So what this recommendation really is saying is put a hold on all the type 3 complex type 3 public review process and allow for housing development to be approved through a very clear, predictable path of type 2 as a process that already exists. And this is not that unique for Portland because, or for Oregon, wouldn't be unique for Oregon because Seattle's actually already started this year. They put a hold on their type 3 review. And during that hold of the review, they are then able to kind of really look through their process to see how it could be refined and made better. And we're proposing the same thing here. And what we're saying during that is to actually also review the clear and objective pathways, which through the state, that's actually provided by all the jurisdictions, but there are a lot of those requirements. So while the moratorium is put on the type 3 discretion review, maybe those objective rules and requirements can also be looked through to simplify it and take out a lot of the requirements. So this is really put in here to make sure that there's a predictability to the approval process of the design and to shorten the timeline by quite a bit amount. So if you scroll further down, basically, you know, so for example, even with the city of Portland, we have had, so I think this, I've already talked about this, like how it will affect the housing production and the speed. So if we go further down, looking at the subject matter experts. So we talked to quite a few subject matter experts. So we talked with a lot of the senior city planners from Wilsonville, Sisters, Salem, Bend, and all of them were supportive of the type 2 more like administrative process. There are some that have kind of you know, brought forth a aspect that, you know, public may want to say that they would have to have an opinion on any developments. So there's that particular democratic rights that people have brought up. What this, you know, I think a lot of the objective rules and requirements that are in place are already coming through that public process already anyway. The type 2 process is already an approved process already anyway. What this just does is just takes away a lot of the uncertain part of the entitlement process. That is all that this is doing, and we don't see it being negative in that sense. So this really features all the back and forth for and cons, pros and cons, pros and cons for the issue. But I feel like a lot of the, you know, cons can really be mitigated because I don't think like we're, you know, really saying that this is going to be a free for all, because the type 2 review process through the administrative process is still a very rigorous process and still provides a very good design review. A case in point is a Hattie Redmond that we just completed with Home Forward and the Urban League of Portland that went through type 2 process. Design is beautiful and, you know, it's doable. So we look further down on the timeline for the process and how it can be done, because we don't see this as, because this is not a zoning change. There's no change in the zoning, any of that. This is only procedural change. We don't see any issue in this being implemented pretty quickly. This does not change a lot of the other procedural process. It only takes away you know, a whole standalone process that was already a side piece anyway. And even for the type 3 design review, the staff still have to do all the review and provide the recommendation to the commission anyway. So if that's the case, might as well just kind of go make it through the type 2 process and have it be a lot more predictable. Let's see what else. And in terms of the impact and to see how this has been impactful or not, I think we can kind of take a look at just the timeline of the entitlement process for a lot of the projects coming through various jurisdictions in the state, and we can easily evaluate pretty quickly whether this recommendation has been effective or not. So with that, I'll pause and open for questions.
Thank you for that. Any questions for? I can't remember your guys' work group names. I keep forgetting. I keep wanting to call it code and design. I mean, land development permit applications, workforce group. Any questions, comments? Sounds good. Okay, let's move on to the next one then, which is, I believe, prohibit suspension of plan review for residential development due to private utility design delays. And I believe that goes back to you, Natalie.
Yeah, but this is my last one.
Okay.
This one is fairly simple. It's basically cities can't suspend the review process due to delays in design submission from private utility companies. So your plan review can't be held up just because the power company hasn't finished their power design. I think that's pretty straightforward. A lot of times projects can get held up because you don't have PGE's light pole design back, and so they won't approve the rest of your construction plans. This recommendation would say that they're not allowed to do that, that they would need to move forward with your construction plan review process without public power plans. Different power companies handle it differently. Some will only start your power plan design once you have constructed public improvement plans. So it can be really challenging if you have it's a chicken and an egg thing sometimes with your public plans. So we had quite a bit of feedback from some small, medium, and large jurisdictions. They pretty much said that the reason that they stopped plan review is not because of any problems for the jurisdiction, but it's more to protect the developer if there's any unforeseen problems that can come up about power availability off-site. But overall, the expected outcome would be that it would be quicker to get your plans approved. So there's really little to no cost. And that's essentially the nuts and bolts of this recommendation. There's currently no, power companies don't have any time requirements on how long it can take them to finish a design. So, and a lot of them are really far out right now. So further recommendation in the works for that. But for the time being, this would address it from the public works side. Happy to take any questions.
Richard Tevi, you are muted.
I'm just over here talking, sorry. Thank you, Councilmember Jenny, for the report, and thank you as well, Councilmember Rajbayata. Good work on that. We'll move on to the next item, seeing that there's no comments or questions, I think, for that last one. Okay, we can jump on to Councilmember Flanagan for availability of land availability with infrastructure. Is Deborah on?
Sorry, JD. Can you see me?
Yep, there you are.
Okay. Is infrastructure first, or is
I think we have land availability with infrastructure.
okay?
Would you like to do them in a different order, or do you have them in?
Is Alyssa on?
No, she's not on yet.
Okay.
We can jump to the next one. If she's doing the first one for infrastructure, we can jump to the UGB expansion process, or which one would you rather do?
JD, can I show my screen? Or not?
That's up to Matt.
Yes, you should be able to. Let me know if not.
What was that? I'm sorry, Matthew.
Oh, you should be able to let me know if it's not working.
Okay. Is that working?
Yes, we can see.
Looks great.
Okay, great. Hello, my name is Deb Flagan, and I'm the chair of the Land Availability Work Group. Today, I'm going to be talking about an expedited UGB expansion recommendation on ready land supply. Why are we recommending this now? What we're recommending is that we are recommending through the legislation to allow cities an optional one-time UGB expansion that sunsets in 10 years to match the emergency order. Secondly, we would streamline the UGB process by directing DLCD to engage with cities that opt in to incorporate their feedback to improve the UGB process as part of the ONA recommendations. And thirdly, that we would add an urban reserve aspect where DLCD would provide technical assistance and establish urban reserves, prioritizing the cities that take advantage of the UGB expansion. We would be utilizing the framework from HB 3414, sections 14 through 24, which is the land availability section. And I'm just going to go over quickly what that incorporates because not everyone is super familiar with the details of HB 3414. So instead of starting new, we would be taking something that was in the last session where many people spent much time working on this bill, and we would be starting this as the basis. What it includes is a one-time optional expedited UGB expansion. Again, it would sunset at 10 years. The land must be adjacent to the current UGB and it must be development ready, which means that there needs to be services nearby that can be pulled. It has to be an urban reserve or non-resource land. This cannot be rural land, or excuse me, this has to be rural land that is not farm or forest land. The land allowance would be that a city over 25,000 would be able to incorporate a one-time 150 net acres. If you're under 25,000 population, you would be able to bring in 75 net residential acres. There is a density requirement where in the metro cities, the density would be 15 units to the acre. Outside of metro and for the large majority of the state, it would be 8 units per acre. And then in the areas of Eastern Oregon and our coastal communities, it would be at 4 units to the acre due to the topography and the slopes in those in many of those cities. This would require a master plan community, which means that it would be incorporated to have walking, biking, transit connections, and there would be a connectivity to the current inside their UGB services. 30% of the homes would be required to be affordable with a 60-year deed restriction. Why are we recommending this now? We're recommending this because the governor has asked us to have bold ideas, and this is definitely a bold recommendation. We are currently short 160,000 units. And that number comes from the 36,000 homes that the governor has asked or has aggressive, she's put an aggressive goal of 36,000 homes in front of us per year. We're currently building 20,000 homes a year on average for the last 5 years. And that's leaving 16,000 units that we need to make up or add each year for 10 years. So we have 160,000 units that we need to add in addition to what we're building now. This opportunity, if every city in the state took advantage of it, could produce 150,000 units. Now we know that that's not going to happen, but there is an opportunity to do that. The governor supported this bill. It had bipartisan support, and we already have a framework that we can start from. This would be adding 30% deed restricted affordable units, and there would be no financial subsidies that would be required to do this at the 30% deed restricted affordable units. The timing coincides with the ONA rulemaking, where cities would be receiving or providing feedback on their UGB expansions, the challenges that they've had, maybe like legal lawsuits, etc. So that could be incorporated into DLCD's ONA making process. And due to the current ONA rulemaking process, cities that are currently in the UGB expansion process will need to wait to complete a housing needs analysis until January of 2025, which is resulting in delayed UGB expansions. And this could be a way forward for some of those cities. This also helps cities establish an urban reserve, which will assist in planning for infrastructure for the future, which we all know is needed. This would be implemented by the legislators would present and pass a bill during the 2024 short session. DLCD would require the local cities that opt in to be prioritized for the ONA rulemaking and stakeholder committees. And there would be provided funding and technical supports to have cities across the state that could apply for a grant to add an urban reserve to their city. And then if the local governments choose to, because this is optional, they can accept a complete community plan through a petition from a willing property owner and a ready developer and builder. These are the requirements that the developer and builder would have to show in their complete community. The mixed income community is integrated, meaning market rate and affordable. 30% of those units would be required to be affordable with the 60-year deed restriction. Rentals would be at 80% AMI or below, and for ownership opportunities, it would be at 130% AMI or below. This would be a master plan community where it includes transportation network, including of the walking, biking, and transit, and connectivity to services inside the UGB. If we are recommending that if it's less than 35 acres, there's many cities that would like to bring in less than 35 acres. They don't need the full 75 acres or 150 acres. And this would be an opportunity where they would not have to go through the extensive and expensive process to be able to bring in or to create a master plan community. And then this would also include different housing types. It's going to be a mix of all diverse housing types as required by ONA. In regards to how this effectiveness is going to be measured, in the bill currently, there is a reporting process to DLCD, and it would be required to report every 2 years on the plan and the progress. We have received feedback from some of the stakeholders, and I wanted to share some of the communication that we've had. Specifically, DLCD, Dr. Bateman and her team were very receptive, and they were timely, very quick to respond to our initial recommendations that we put forward. we incorporated all of the items that they sent back. There was some significant changes from what was originally approved based on their information. The biggest item is that we had suggested initially to do an executive order, and DLCD's recommendation is that we would do this through a legislative action instead. And we have made those changes. I have sent them a letter back with our current recommendation, and I'm asking them to review and make sure that there's nothing that they have comments on or that we can improve upon. And they are also in the current process of looking at the mapping of the non-resource land. So we can see across the state how many cities are actually surrounded by farm and forest. I did want to make one note. They did mention that there was $3.5 million that was approved during the legislation 2023 legislative session, and that was for technical support for housing and urbanization during 2023 to 2025. And they've already received 9 requests for people that are interested in initiating an urban reserve. They just don't know exactly how they're going to prioritize all those people that are coming in with the 3.5 million. So there's more money that's needed there. We also spent some time with Metro, and I really appreciate Ted and Andy's feedback. I did follow up with them this past week, and their biggest concerns about this is that they feel like they have their own Metro process, and they're concerned that adding this process is going to circumvent their current system and create confusion. They also don't believe that many cities will take advantage due to the last expansion opportunity, that there were very few people that applied. After the conversation, the recommendation that we put forward is that we would like to have 900-acre max, which would allow up to 6 cities to take advantage of this. There's 23 metro cities. 10 of those cities are adjacent to an urban reserve that could take advantage of this. 51% of the population in the state is in those 23 cities. And so our feeling was that making sure that there really is an opportunity for at least 6 cities to take advantage of this would be appropriate. And then I am appreciative. Yesterday, I had a meeting with Mary Kyle and Central Oregon Land Watch, Corey, and received some really good information. And I believe that I've captured their 2 biggest concerns. Number one is that they believe that there is enough land inside the UGB, and infrastructure is the issue that is needed. And if we were to do that, we wouldn't need to do urban growth expansions. And then the second item is the expected UGB expansions, expedited UGB expansions should be allowed for select cities, not for every city. And specifically in regards to that, we agree that infrastructure is an issue. I think you're hearing it across all of our, or many of our committees. And I'm hopeful that we're going to have a recommendation that we put forward for funding. But as I pointed out yesterday, that the infrastructure funding is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to take years for that infrastructure to actually be in place and actually get housing built in our cities. We're going to have to find the funding. We're going to have to put out the process in regards to how we're going to do the funding. We're then going to take applications. Then we have to go get RFPs from the cities and get that out for bid. Then we have to actually build it. And then you have to have actual landowners that are willing to put together a community and actually build that and build those homes. So we're estimating that it's going to be a long-term fix, a fix that's needed, but it will take years. So the last item that I would say is that on the expedited UGB expansion, the reason why the homes can be built quickly is because you have to have a willing landowner that's willing to work with the cities and a developer to come together with a master plan that is approved by the cities. And once those are approved, then the financing is actually on the developer to build these communities. So you don't have to go through the funding cycle of necessarily going through the affordable housing piece of it. You can actually start building that community. You could partner with an affordable housing partner, and they would have time then and be allowed to actually go through that funding cycle to actually get some of those units built. We believe that you could actually see these homes being built in a 3 to 4 year time period and on the ground where people are moving in. JD, I think that's the end.
Great. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions for the land availability work group? Mr. Hill.
I'm struggling a little, just a bit on how these all tie together. I'll start down with the 8 per acre, 4 per acre rural versus I guess metro. Are you saying that that's mandatory 8 per acre in a metro area and 4 per acre? Or if we could get 8 in that urban area, that would be okay? Not following your recommendation there.
Thank you, Mayor Hill. In regards to the density, it's actually, the requirement is 15 units per acre in the metro areas. There are actually specific counties that are called out in the bill currently, and I didn't go into exact detail, but basically in the rural communities and the coastal communities, it's a required 4 units per acre. And in all of the other cities throughout the state, it's at 8 units per acre.
So I'm trying to tie them together. So we have, you mentioned farmable land, like where I live, we got the river on one side and you can go north or you can go kind of to the west, pretty much all farmable land. So are we precluded?
Riley, you are not right now. This is right now, a DLCD is doing a analysis for us and doing the mapping to be able to show us which cities are surrounded completely by farm and forest, and they are not precluded at this point. They would not be able to be built in. And that was actually one of the comments from Nick Green, which was a subject matter expert that talked about the challenges and not being able to expand their urban growth because of that.
Okay, then I want to go to your 80 to 130 AMI and the 60-year deed restriction. That must apply only to rental units. Is that right? Because you have a 60-year, because the ability to sell with that deed restriction would be severely restricted.
Riley, this is actually, it's 80% AMI or below for rental units. And it's actually
80 or below. I thought it was 80 to 130.
So it's 8. So if you were to produce rental units, it would be 80% AMI or below. And that would have to be deed restriction. Or if you were to build for sale product, it would be at 130% AMI or below. And yes, it would be, significantly less. That is why this is basically the requirement for a developer to be able to come in and do this is that there would be a restriction for them to be able to that they would be restricted on 30% of the units.
All right, thank you.
Representative Dexter.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Deb, for your work on this. 2 questions. One, development ready. I'm assuming that it's adjacent to infrastructure. We're not actually talking about finding development ready land outside of the UGB that already exists.
That's correct. Yes. So just services could be pulled in and used.
Okay. Second question, if a local jurisdiction were to use the sub 35 acre option without a master plan and they did one, would they then be still able to expand into 75 or 150 acres? Or is that one-time sub 35 acre plan going to use up that option for that jurisdiction?
Thank you for clarifying it. This is actually just a one-time option. So if the city was to approve it and it was at 10 acres, that would be their only time that they could do it. And we actually have had a couple coastal communities, one in particular that has said that they would like to have used HB 3414, but they would not have been able to, or they would not have wanted to because they only needed to bring in, I believe it was 10 acres of land, but they didn't want to go through the whole master plan process because of the extensiveness. So I think this encourages cities to do less, do what they need and stay small if needed.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for those questions. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Hearing none, I'm looking at just doing a quick time check. We've got about 25 minutes left and about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 left to go through. So let's jump into the wetlands. I believe, is that you as well, Councilmember Flagan?
JD, we are going to ask to move the wetlands to the next round, so Eric can join us.
Okay, sounds good. And so we will jump back up to the top of the list for Erica Mills from Workforce Development on workforce shortages. Are you ready, Erica?
One minute. Okay, first of all, thank you, co-chairs and everybody for accommodating my travel schedule. And also apologies for pulling this back and forth. We were hoping to get it in this round and we weren't totally on the same page with this. So I'm going to look to the full group to answer a couple of questions about how we want to proceed with it at this stage. But to lay the ground, I think that we all are aware of and understanding that there's a real limitation on contractors to get work done, that there's plenty of work out there, but it's difficult to find people to do the work. And as we learned from our SMEs, we are losing workforce at a pretty rapid rate. And at this point, we're losing more annually than we're gaining. And the key barrier to that is entry into an apprenticeship program. So currently, apprenticeship ratios are set relatively stringently with most trades have a 1-to-1, 1 apprentice to 1 journey level worker ratio. Some trades have much more strict rules. In my standards of analysis, I talked a lot about the inside electrician because that tends to be the area where there's the greatest roadblock for residential construction. And in that area, there is, sorry, I'm just trying to pull it up here so I can make sure I'm giving the exact number. I believe it's 2 to 3. Forgive me as I'm just getting to my desk. Yeah, I believe it's 2 to 3. I'm sorry. Riley, can you do you have it on the top of your mind exactly what the ratio is?
The ratios for inside electricians right now is 3 journey workers to 2 apprentices.
Okay, so I was right. It tends to be listed in the opposite, apprentices to journey workers, so 2 to 3. So what we're proposing is making a change to that, increasing the number of apprentices to journey workers. Where we came into some internal strife is exactly how to make that recommendation. We're all in agreement that we need to increase the ratios. We need to bring more apprentices in. But the question is just, how does this recommendation get framed? Now, we did speak to quite a lot of SMEs who had quite a lot of feedback about this. And they were coming from very different perspectives. So A large group of SMEs were quite resistant to any changes to the ratios, while another group of SMEs was really quite in favor of that. And in doing some research, we found that in 2005, the Independent Contractors Association actually helped move forward some proposed legislation to increase those ratios, and that legislation failed. In retrospect, looking back, if that legislation had passed, we'd be in a wildly different position right now with a number of contractors available. And so, taking that into account, I think we need to be a little bit more bold. Now, a couple of things that came to light in our conversations with SMEs is that there are 2 states of note that have reciprocity for trade licenses in the state of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Idaho is a really stark example, particularly because of its proximity to, the proximity of Boise to Ontario. And in fact, the administrator in charge of the local apprenticeship committee in Malheur and Harney counties is an Idaho contractor. In Idaho, they allow 4 apprentices per journeyman. And we were not able to find any specific data to indicate that there was any quality issues or health or safety issues related to that apprenticeship ratio specifically.
May I interrupt you, Erica, just a second?
Sure.
Okay. They were at 1 to 4, 1 journeyman to 4 apprentices until the legislature stepped in at the last go around. And so it's now 1 to 4 for commercial construction for electricians and 1 to 6 for residential construction. The legislature stepped in and moved it up to 1 to 6.
So if a licensed Idaho contractor or electrician or person in any trade would like to work in Oregon, then there's an application that needs to be filled out, and they need to check the boxes verifying that they have indeed completed all the requirements to achieve that reciprocity. And it appears that if you're able to get the license in Idaho, then it's just a matter of box checking an application, filling out to get the license in Oregon. Similarly, in Washington, they have a 1-to-1 ratio. And they also don't appear to have any health or safety or quality issues related to that ratio. So it is curious to us that the state of Oregon would be so much more restrictive. And we've asked a number of times why, and the SMEs largely are citing issues that there's no data to back that up. We were provided with one study that's quite old. It's about 8 years old or more, that indicates that the safety in Washington is actually higher just for all trades, all contractors. All-cause deaths for contractors on the job in Washington is less than in Oregon. So again, that goes to show that the safety issue is not really, it's not clear that there's grounds for the safety as a cause for having more strict ratios. And then also it should be noted that we have an inside limited residential electrical apprenticeship opportunity in Oregon that has a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's widely acknowledged that small job residential work does not require as much supervision. Now, our recommendation at this stage is to make changes to the number of apprentices to journey level workers. But we're also recommending that apprentices with more experience be supervised at a reduced ratio. So, and this can be phrased a couple of different ways, and we haven't been able to settle on the language of this yet. One way to phrase it would be if you are an apprentice that has achieved enough experience and passed enough tests that you are eligible for an indirect supervision card, which means that you can go to a job site without the direct physical presence of a journeyman, then our recommendation is that the journeyman be able to supervise more than one of those eligible apprentices. Another argument could be made simply by the year of experience. So maybe you would, once you have a second or third or fourth year apprentice, then you can see you can, as a journeyman worker, you can supervise more than one, maybe up to 4. Also, we've included in this recommendation the establishment of a limited residential plumber symbol, and that's just a way to phrase that as being a separate license or a separate trade item. And the reason for that is it was acknowledged from our SMEs that plumbing a house is quite a lot different than plumbing a commercial building or a large high-rise or some infrastructure. So in the same spirit as the limited residential electrician, having a limited residential plumber might open up the field for more apprentices to get into the work. And yes, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much for that. Is there any questions for Erica or anybody else on the workforce development team?
If I might add, because I'm on the border and all of our plumbers and electricians come from Idaho. Idaho has one journey worker, plumbing journey worker to an unlimited amount of apprentices. So all the training and everything that we get here in this area comes from Idaho trained plumbers and electricians.
And I think the question that we need to put to the full HPAC is how, similar to the spirit of some of our previous recommendations that we've heard, how in the weeds do we want to get? Do we want this recommendation to specifically call out numbers? Or do we want to just call out the need for it and allow the implementation process, whatever that looks like, to determine what the actual number is?
Representative Dexter.
Thanks. And thank you, Erica, for all your hard work and for that question, because I think that's really important. As one of the lawmakers, I would say that this will be a heavily debated topic, and having, clear recommendations with substantiation for why the ratios are recommended at where they are, if there are data on quality. I'm guessing that the 6 electricians in a residential area in Idaho won't have data yet if it just passed, but if there are for the 1-to-4 ratio, like having that information, at least in the recommendation, would be helpful, because this will become something that, gets negotiated.
Any other questions, comments? And I don't know if Damien has a recommendation either, but we can, on how far to get in the weeds, that might be something we can discuss. Maybe it's guardrails, or maybe it's kind of like a range, or examples of the neighboring states and what they do. That might not be like do this, but it's like these are what other people are doing, and might be something we consider.
And I'll also add that we have a couple of related recommendations that we'll be discussing in our work group meeting next week that I think will help support this. Some of the concerns or unforeseen circumstances might be things along the lines of the cost for implementation, for example, on the small businesses and that are actually the actual contractors. And so we'll be putting forth a future recommendation that can help offset that. So similar to as in the land use recommendations, these will be sort of mutually supportive recommendations that will be coming in the future.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Hill.
The point that Erica made up front is very clear. When you have a 3-to-2 ratio for electricians, we're falling behind. We lose the number of electricians every year because some are retiring when you do a 3-to-2 ratio. And they don't all become, in the field electricians. Some become inspectors, some become business agents, some work in the field of sales, some work in the office, and we're just getting farther and further behind. And I want the decision makers to realize that when they think this over. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Senator Jama?
Thank you, Chair, Co-Chair. I guess the question I have is that, would that, Erica, then are we attaching then will it increase the workforce X number of percentage or throughout the years? Or is there any expectations or predictions that will take place in terms of the this particular policy? And then the last question is that how this will tie to the wages as well in terms of the either wage increases or so I think that will be another issue that probably will be addressed.
So great questions. Thank you. I did some really rough math. If we just increase a level of 1-to-1, looking only at the inside electricians, that will have an immediate impact of adding 30% to the electrical apprentices. If we're also able to implement a recommendation that allows for more than 1-to-1 ratios, or for more third, fourth year apprentices or apprentices who have their indirect supervision card, that would increase that even further. Then as the years go on and that initial pool, let's say conservatively of 30% increase becomes journeyman or journey level workers, then they can see also an increase in the apprentices that they work. So that math compounds, every 4 years at a minimum. Is that helpful? And then I'm sorry, can you repeat your second question?
Thank you. No, that's super helpful. The other question that I had was that I don't know how that ties to wages, wage increases, because I think that was another issue that we're grappling in terms of the lower wage that folks get paid in terms of.
Yeah. So currently, apprentices are paid a percent of their wage based on their level of experience, and that's set by the local JATC or TATC, and supervised by the Oregon State Association of Trade Contractors, OSAC. I can't remember now that stands for exactly, but in any case, so those rates are set by region, and this wouldn't impact what those rates are. I will say, however, that the wages that the apprentices are paid is paid by the employer. Currently there's no, as far as we've understood from the SMEs and from our research, there's no subsidy or other cost offset for the employer. They are responsible for the burden of the wages and any benefits, if applicable, as well as overhead and insurance. So a future recommendation that we'll be putting together does advocate for some subsidies to help cover that cost. And the hope is that if we're covering that cost, then that'll only open the doors more to allow more apprentices to come in.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Okay, hearing none, we have 2 items left. One is from Councilmember Wood on tree standards. Do you want to go ahead and do that? Are you ready?
Sure.
There you go.
I am.
Right.
I appreciate you guys moving me back. I had several different conflicts I had to work through this afternoon, so I'm glad I could actually get back home instead of doing this from my car. So, yeah, we talked about trees and development situations, and specifically we wanted to talk about cities that had tree codes. Not every city has tree codes, but some cities have tree codes that are a little bit more difficult to work with when it comes to development situations. And we're specifically trying to talk about smaller sites and smaller development sites and lots that are targeted for more density. And we're also trying to target kind of it's hard to place what the number of average is, but kind of your average to smaller trees, not your heritage trees, not your large trees, not the trees that are going to be your more significant trees. So we broke our recommendation kind of into 2 parts. The first is dealing with developed lots. And this is largely what you're seeing in cities where you're going to be seeing the middle housing going in. So what the current recommendation is on platted lots less than 6,000 square feet, where you're increasing the density from its current configuration, that a permit should not be denied for the removal of trees less than 48 inches in diameter, and fees in lieu shall not be charged for that removal. For trees larger than 48 inches, the city or jurisdiction is required to offer a program that allows for either replacement trees to be planted or a fee in lieu option, with reasonable caps on the fees. I'll kind of, as we go through this real quick, we heard back originally. This proposal was we just kind of started at some numbers for talking points. This was started at 10,000 square feet. We heard from the city of Salem that 6,000 square feet was a more appropriate size for a lot of their infill development lots that are already platted lots. The city of Portland, a large percentage of their lots are at 5,000 square feet. So we felt that 6,000 square foot number when it comes to residential infill pre-platted lots was a kind of a more fair number that incorporated a lot of the lots that are kind of intended for that middle housing. And then we originally also had proposed 60 inches. We had heard from several cities and several SMEs during our proposal that 60 inches was really rather large, and that only incorporated the largest few percentage of trees. So we lowered that number down to 48 inches. So on the larger development sites, and these are lands that are already inside an urban growth boundary, have already been planned and counted for growth and development, that basically the same parameters, if you're averaging 6,000 square feet or lot less on newly created lots, and that same 48 inches diameter on trees, and allowing you to either do planting or a fee in lieu of. The other part of that that we run into a lot is development, is that many times infrastructure is not flexible. Whether it's your design or the city's requirements, there's only certain places you can put stormwater, roads, approaches, sidewalks, various other things. And sometimes there's trees that are right smack dab in the middle of those places, and there's no other place that you can put that required infrastructure to be able to service those lots. So that was something that we discussed, that if the tree is located right in a particular area, that you have to put the needed infrastructure, that the trees are allowed to be removed. In both of these cases, this would not apply in riparian corridors. It would not apply in environmental protection areas. And we also put in there, some cities are not consistent with allowing you to have a prescriptive path to preserve the tree, where it's a prescriptive path means that you've got a set rules you can follow in order to preserve the tree, and also allowing you an arborist path, where if an arborist comes in and says, here's how you can preserve the tree, that allowing that arborist recommended path is a way to be able to preserve that tree. So allowing that to kind of to be more consistent with that. In both cases, this would be something that, consistent with the governor's order, would be a 10-year plan. Just some of the SMEs, this feedback that we heard really quick. We had some discussion, as I mentioned earlier, on the tree sizes and the lot sizes. We got some pretty good feedback, which is in your attachment, from the city of Salem. Some of their concerns specifically were dealing with, they have specific trees such as white oaks, which they really try to preserve down there. We did not get into specific trees in this bin, because we felt that that could be something more on the city level or the legislative level. Then they also went a little bit more in depth into how the needed infrastructure worked, which again is in their attachment. We actually received 2 comments from the city of Portland. They didn't make it in your packet, so I don't know if we can get it out to everybody before the next round, but in your packet, you've got a letter from the Urban Forestry and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability with some feedback on their feedback on the trees and the importance on trying to preserve the trees. The Bureau of Development Services did provide some comments that their tree code has provided a challenge for some of the development situations, and they're hearing from the developers in the city of Portland that their tree code is proving to be a little bit of a challenge, and they're trying to figure out a balance between finding a tree code that works and also preserving those important larger trees. So the other thing that's in your packet, just for a reference, it's the last page, and I don't know if it's up on the screen. I'm sorry, I didn't have it ready, but just an example of a real world lot that I have that's just over a 5,000 square foot lot in the city of Portland that is zoned for a 3 or a 4-plex. We're putting a middle housing project on it. It's a project that's going to be 3 units. All are going to be targeted at or below 100% of median family income. There's one 40-inch tree on the lot already. That 40-inch tree, under the current rules, basically prove that lot to be either undevelopable, or you have to pay over a $20,000 fee to remove that tree. So we're trying to find that balance of how do we allow development on these infill lots that are targeted for middle housing, and also trying to find a balance of preserving those significant trees. So I'm happy to kind of have any questions about this from the group. I went through that relatively quickly.
Thank you so much. Questions from Representative Dexter?
Thanks. Staying true to form. I'm just thinking about development and why the 48-inch diameter. Thinking about like a mature Douglas fir that I think is a fairly standard diameter for a mature one. I know old growth can be 5 to 6 feet in diameter, but that just feels like a sizable diameter to me. So how did we land on that?
Quite honestly, I would like to say it was scientific, but a lot of it was just kind of what I've seen out in the field. So I actually served back when City of Portland put their tree code together back in like late, I want to say 2017, 2018. I was on that stakeholder group, the Title 11 trees. And we had originally started at kind of a 48 inches was the place we had started at as our discussion points. And we had brought in arborists and various other experts. Ultimately, what came out of the City of Portland recommendation was 36 inches. And that's what was the initial basis for Title 11. That's since been lowered down further. But when I'm looking at lots and seeing a lot of middle housing stuff and a lot of the things we're looking at, yeah, it's funny you mentioned Douglas fir trees. On fairly frequently, we see a lot of what I'll call a fairly average Portland size fir tree that is in that 36 to 45 inch range. That just seems to be I hate to use common because I'm not trying to downplay the importance of those trees, but that seems to be a fairly common size that we see on fir trees when I'm looking at lots. And so, and one thing I do want to point out is there was been some conversation too, specifically in Portland, about some of your, the heat islands and some of the areas where we don't have trees, specifically on the larger lots in Southeast Portland. This wouldn't apply because this is 6,000 square foot lots or less. Most of those lots in Southeast Portland are bigger, 10,000 to 20,000 square foot lots, and this wouldn't apply to that.
If I could add to, when we're looking at what size tree, it's not just a matter of the area that the tree represents and the challenges, but also the area that needs to be protected around it. So currently a lot of jurisdiction, well, like Salem, I can speak to Salem's because I do a lot of work in Salem. Their tree code says that you have to protect the critical root zone, which is measured at 1 foot in radius for every inch in diameter. So if you're looking at a 50-inch tree, that's a 100-foot diameter circle that you're not allowed to do anything around. And so while that is a 48-inch tree is a large tree, it's not just about the tree, it's the land that is encompassed around it when we try and preserve it as well. So that's part of it too, is how much land are we using to save around the tree too.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions for Councilmember Wood or the co-design team? Hearing none, we can move on to Councilmember Gertler. I believe you are last up for land availability and infrastructure.
All right. Well, I regret being late and missing the discussion, and I don't know if there have been other parts of the conversation that have touched on infrastructure. I know if we had $1 for every time we said infrastructure, we would already have funding for housing. Yeah. So in the tradition of the land availability work group, we have a PowerPoint that I quickly want to walk through, and I don't know if any of my committee members want to jump in, but I will go through it, and then the committee members can jump in. So this is about investing in cities, doing infrastructure for housing production. Next slide. The core of our recommendation, I just want to say, there's been this conversation with the committee about especially the finance work group regarding funding sources and funding methods for creating an infrastructure funding source. And we like that. And so what we're trying to do is to match the uses with the sources, since we are focused more on the land availability and making land ready for development. So I think one of the questions for the group is, what does alignment of these two recommendations look like? That's what we seek to do by recommending some sort of programmatic things that are really focused on land availability. So speaking to identifying the new infrastructure funding source to support the 10-year housing production horizon. There is an existing Business Oregon infrastructure and facilities inventory. We recommend expanding it to include housing infrastructure, particularly sewer, water, and transportation, and then using that inventory to guide the business infrastructure, the housing infrastructure fund that Business Oregon would run. I will mention that we did consult with Business Oregon and they are supportive of this. And then there's a series of recommendations around prioritizing these scarce state resources to the places where the need is the greatest. So those cities that are producing housing at 80% AMI for longer than 30 years, those who are complying with DLCD's requirements around housing production strategies where they have identified infrastructure as a key issue to address housing production. And then this is the reward cities who are doing the right thing, cities who have demonstrated implementation of multiple policy, regulatory, and funding tools to increase housing production. And then I think the other key thing here is to recognize that cities of different sizes and different capacities have different needs. So try to customize a program that speaks to large cities, medium cities, and small cities. And then we've had a lot of conversation about who would be an eligible applicant. And we believe that municipalities make sense when you look at it through the land availability lens. They are the ones responsible for making land ready for development. We would expect them to partner with either a special district or a private or a nonprofit developer. So it wouldn't rule out anyone, but the state resources would go to local governments. Next slide, please. So the why this, why now question, I think we all know, as we've been talking about, infrastructure is a key issue for housing production, particularly around land readiness. One of the key things we talked about is the existing state housing policy, whether it be the DLCD rules or what OHCS is already doing, the infrastructure programs around Business Oregon, that there is opportunity to align state funding with the existing state housing policy. And also to build upon the existing processes and mechanisms that already exist in state agencies. So a quick implementation runway, if you will. And then again, trying to link the Finance Committee recommendation to the sources, to the uses, is what kind of our goal here. Next slide. So just how, obviously there's a role for the governor, key role for the state legislature. Implementation would be done through a Business Oregon infrastructure funding program, since they have hundreds of those already. But the policy alignment work would come from the two state departments who are working on housing policy at multiple levels. Next slide. Again, we are trying to emphasize that with scarce resources, you want to accomplish the most public benefit. We are clearly aware that the place that requires the most public subsidy is the lowest income housing. And so we recommend that, again, to try to align with what the state is already trying to do with its investments in state housing funds and state land use funds, that there be some targeting toward affordability. Next slide. Similarly, I mentioned this earlier, the goal here is to support local governments who are trying to do what they are supposed to do by the state's requirements for housing production and housing needs. So again, aligning where we can already things that are moving by putting the resources behind them to accomplish them. I think this is last slide, or maybe second to last slide. Next slide. So we didn't do a lot of setting of performance measures. We would imagine that the governor and legislature would want to set some targets for production amounts and targets. And then we would imagine that Business Oregon would have a mechanism to report back annually on progress toward those targets and investments. Next slide. Well, this is not a big surprise to you. This is in our standards of analysis document. What are the key trade-offs? Well, finding new money to pay for housing infrastructure is a complicated question. And we have some pretty smart people in the legislature who we will trust to carry that conversation forward. Next slide. I just will take any questions and wanted to put an illustration of a great example for you. And that is it. We can stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much. Any questions for Councilmember Gertler or anybody else on that team? Senator Jama.
Thank you, Councilor. I think the first slide that you had, you highlighted that prioritizing cities that are producing, I believe it was 80 AMI, and then I think one couple of slides later, you had another slide that's saying that about 60 AMI. Can you clarify those two? And the first one is it 80 AMI or above, or 80 and AMI below and below?
Thank you for that question. In the slide that spoke to the 60% AMI, that comes right out of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis document and is just the sort of analytical underpinning that we're using. Upon further discussion with the committee and with some of the subject matter experts and stakeholders, we set our target recommendation at the 80% AMI, just recognizing that when cities are building infrastructure, if you're building a road or a wastewater plant or whatever it may be, that the jurisdiction will likely try to maximize the amount of development that can be served by the infrastructure. And so some of it might be low income housing, some of it might be more market rate. And so trying to find a sort of middle ground was our recommendation, but certainly, there could be additional changes to that in terms of really wanting to set a target around being aggressive on affordability or moving toward flexibility in terms of knowing that cities who are going to build infrastructure are going to probably build it for more than one development at any given time.
Thank you. Any more questions? Hearing none, I'm going to turn it over. That was our last one for the day. So with 1 minute to spare, thank you everybody for plowing through that. I know a couple got moved on to next week, so we made it through. So I'm going to turn over to Matt for any kind of last minute operational stuff.
All right. Thank you, Co-Chair Tuvey. So I will just say, both for the council and the members of the public, the next meeting of the Production Advisory Council will be September the 8th at our normal time. At that meeting, there'll be, similar to this meeting, we'll have kind of two sections. One will be the introduction of the Ready Built Plans recommendation and the two wetlands recommendations that both got carried forward to the next meeting. So that will be meeting 1 of 3 on the Ready Built Plans and wetlands. And then we will move into meeting 2 on all of the recommendations that were introduced today in this large section of our agenda. And that will be for public comment, as well as further council member discussion. For public comment, you can always submit written comment at hpac.gov@oregon.gov. We compile public comment and provide that to the council prior to the second meeting on recommendations. And you can also sign up ahead of time for testimony at hpac.gov@oregon.gov. And please specify the recommendations that you're interested in testifying on. And then we also just take people who raise their hands during the meeting. So with that, I will stop talking because it's 4 o'clock.
Well, thank you, everybody. Anything else from any of the last minute comments, questions? Nothing. Well, I thank you all for your hard work. This is an amazing amount of work. Like I said, we're about halfway through our assignments. Well, halfway through our allotted time. So we'll be plowing through a lot more in the next couple of months. So I look forward to the additional recommendations and the future conversations. Do you have anything, Chair Hall? Nothing?
I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Thank you all for the great work.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Okay.